Well, we're at the Hudson River Valley Farm of S.E. Esselstyn, the number 6 man in the 1956 Yale Olympic crew. And Tommy Charlton on my right here, who was the bowman in that boat. I had the privilege and honor of being the coxswain of that boat in 1956. And we were a very happy boat. Every 5 years after the Olympics, as a way of keeping our friendship together, we had a reunion, primarily around the Harvard-Yale boat race in Groton, Connecticut every year. And that went on until we had lost 5 members of that crew that had gone to the big race upstairs, at which time we decided the 5-year intervals were way too long, and we decided that we had to have a reunion of the Olympic crew every 4 years. And the first one was at Essie's farm, and subsequent to that, I believe that was probably 10 or 15 years ago. It was quite a while. Actually, yeah, it was right after, I think, Charlie Grimes passed away.
And John Cook.
And John Cook, and Don Beer, and Rusty Wales. So there would be 5 of us that started. We are now down to 3. Today is the 14th of June, 2021. And we thought we had the invitation of John Bigelow to join us for this reunion and film our story, to talk a little bit about our own Boys in the Boat story 20 years after the Boys in the Boat
This
book.
is the men in the boat.
Might call the men in the boat at this point in time. So at John Bigelow's suggestion, as sort of a preview before we get into the story of our Olympic story itself, John thought it would be interesting if we talked a little bit about how every member of the boat got into rowing and ended up at Yale, and happened to end up as the title of a short book that Dave White wrote. Literally, he wrote the last page the day before he died, called Right Place, Right Time. How did it happen that 9 of us ended up in the right place at the right time? So I guess that's what we're going to talk about today. So Tommy, why don't you start in the bow, and we'll work our way down the boat, talking a little bit about each one of the people that made up that crew.
Okay, I'm Tom Charlton. Originally my home was Savannah, Georgia. I knew nothing about rowing. There's no rowing really in the South in those days. But I ended up going to St. Paul's School in the 9th grade, and I began rowing there. And that was the spring of 1949. And basically I stayed into rowing for the rest of my life. After finishing at St. Paul's...
Can I ask who the coach was for you?
We had various coaches at school. St. Paul's had a unique rowing program. It was all intramural. There was no outside racing in those days, well, with one exception. And basically we rowed against each other. The school was divided up into 2 rowing clubs, Halcyons and Shaddocks. The boats, typically the same coach would coach 4 crews at 2 alternates, 2 Halcyon crews and 2 Shaddock. My senior year, our coach was had to be my math teacher, and he. I'm having a senior moment now. I can't remember his name, but he coached both our opposite number in the other club, and we ended up racing against the other clubs, the other club. Most of that particular year, which was 1952, for the first time in history, St. Paul's actually sent a boat to an outside race. But because we had two club boats, we sent 2 boats. They didn't select a varsity boat at that time, we sent, in 1952, spring of 1952, St. Paul sent 2 crews to the Worcester Regatta to the Schoolboy Regatta there, which was the first time any crews from St. Paul's had ever raced anybody except other St. Paul's boats. Anyway, that was my introduction to rowing at St. Paul's. I rowed there 4 years.
What, any particular seat that you rode, or any particular?
Oh, I rode in various seats. I was always a starboard oarsman, but I rode up and down the boat. And I think senior year I rode 7. I can't remember now to tell you the truth. But ended up going to Yale, and again went out for rowing. By then I'd become thoroughly addicted to the sport, which I did spend the rest of my life in. And I ended up going out for the freshman crew. I was pretty light, just a little over 160 pounds. And at that time, fortunately, the division between lightweight rowing and heavyweight rowing was 5 pounds. I think the lightweight crews then had to average 150 pounds. And the only reason I didn't get put in the lightweight squad was because one, I would lie about my weight when I weighed myself, and secondly because it was a little bit lighter than it ended up being later. But anyway,
Was there any recruiting for rowing when you went to college?
Not that I know of.
So you just went as a student,
I just went
and
as a
then
student.
happened to go out for
But
it.
well, it wasn't. Well, then I was addicted to rowing, and I stayed addicted to it for the rest of my life. And it was the only sport I was ever good at, really, and I was pretty good at it. So it was natural for me to go out for the freshman crew. I made the freshman crew. I rode in all the freshman races.
When you say you made the freshman crew, does that mean you made the first boat, the second boat?
Yeah, I made the first boat, and made the first freshman boat, and raced in all our races. The highlight of our freshman year, we had been beaten by Harvard in the Eastern Sprint Championships, which Harvard crew had won. Harvard freshman crew had won the freshman race in the Eastern Sprint Championships, and we had lost to them in that race. I'm not even sure we came in second. I don't remember where we came in, but we raced Harvard up at Gales Ferry, and the Yale Harvard boat race up there, and we beat Harvard, which was a great.
Did you have a separate coach from the?
No,
From
we
the
had
varsity?
the same coach, same crew, basically the same crew.
How long?
Al Long.
Al Long was
Al Long was our coach
the freshman Yale freshman
for
coach
Not
1 year.
varsity.
For 1 year, and he was.
and varsity.
No, he was freshman coach, only freshman coach,
Oh, okay.
and he had rowed for who was the Penn coach?
Joe.
No, not Joe. Joe's coach. The guy was a Navy coach later on.
Rusty.
Or
No, Rusty.
Rusty Callow.
Rusty Callow was a great Penn coach, and Al Long was a protege of Rusty Callow. And he thought that, Al thought that when Rusty retired from the Naval Academy, that he'd be in line for Rusty's job. Turned out that didn't happen, but, so he only coached Yale freshman crew for 1 year, and then he quit. But that happened to be my freshman year.
And how do you remember how the racing season went in the Harvard Yale race?
Well, we beat in a very dramatic race. We beat Harvard over 2 miles in a freshman year.
How was it dramatic?
Well, they'd beaten us before, and we had it in for them. And the history of my rowing has always been to sort of come back from a defeat and get your revenge. And so I certainly felt that way about that.
And do you remember what seat you were in?
I was in the bow seat, I think. I almost always rode bow, not by choice, but that's where I was stuck. I was light. I was relatively light, and I guess I had pretty good balance or something. So I seemed to end up in the bow, and that was the history of my rowing career, for my entire career. I ended up as a club oarsman, ended up in the bow seat, steering lots and lots of different boats. Because in coxless boats, the bowman always does the steering. So that was Anyway, I had a pretty successful career as my freshman year. I mean, we did pretty well. Beating Harvard was a big deal. And then I made the varsity boat my sophomore year. And matter of fact, I was never out of the seat in the varsity boat after my freshman year. Every race, other people came and went, but I stayed there. I stayed in the bow and for 3 years. And so we had our ups and downs. Bill, in his memoir, recounts a little bit about my junior year. We started off the season and hadn't done very well. But Jim Rashbit put a new coach, our coach, Jim Rashbit, put a new crew together. And we ended up racing in the Eastern Sprint Championships against the great 1952 Naval Academy crew that had won the Olympics in Helsinki. And we came in second to them, losing to them by a deck length, so which was as close as anybody ever came to that particular crew in their history. So we did pretty well at the end of the season. I went on to beat Harvard. And then I ended up in the, I rode in the, that was my junior year, ended up in my senior year in the varsity boat again, and stayed in it. And it turned out we won the Olympic trials in that year and went to the Olympics, which was sort of the rest of the story, which I won't get into right now.
The number 2 seat in the boat, the Olympic boat, was occupied by Dave White. He was one of 3 seniors in the boat. Tom was a senior, Dave was a senior. S.E. Esselstyn in the 6th seat was also a senior. And we'll have his bio in a couple of minutes here. But I'll talk for Dave White. I go way back with Dave White. 3 of us in the Yale Olympic crew had gone to Exeter. Bob Morey and I were class of 1954 at Exeter. Dave White was class of 1952. I had the very good fortune of making the varsity crew at Exeter, first varsity crew at Exeter as a coxswain in 1952. And Dave White was the stroke of the boat. I was very fortunate to become the coxswain of a boat that had 4 seniors in it at Exeter. We did not have a really great season. We rode 4s at the time, and as I recall, I think we beat Brooks School, and I think that might have been the only school we beat, and we rotated the boat around for a while, and the boat finally came together just before the school board regatta, which took place out on Lake Quinsigamond in Worcester, Massachusetts in the spring of 1952, and we won that school board regatta, which was a real point of pride for us. On the way back in, and we used to ride out there in the coach's Oldsmobile, as I recall. On the way back in, back to Exeter after we won that, the coach said, "Well, guys, you know, the Olympic trials are going to be held on Lake Quinsigamond in just 3 weeks."
Was Dave White in that boat?
Well, Dave White was the stroke of my 4.
And Bob Murray was?
No, Bob Morey was not in the boat. There were 4 seniors in the Exeter crew, and the coach said, "Would you guys be interested in sticking around for 3 weeks and entering the Olympic trials?" Well, of course. Why would we want to do that? So we did. We took that 4 down to Lake Quinsigamond in the spring of 1952 into the 1952 Olympic trials, and to the surprise of everyone that was there, we won the first heat in a time that turned out to be the fastest time recorded by any Forworth coxswain in the trials. We were a very light crew. We might have averaged maybe 175 pounds. There was a tailwind the first day, And the second day, the semifinals, the wind turned around, which is not a good thing for a lightweight crew, and we lost. But in any event, the first day we beat Harvard in California, and I can tell you there were 8 really unhappy college oarsmen having been beaten by a bunch of high school kids. Well, it turns out that Dave White's grandfather, father, and brother had all rowed on Yale crews. So Dave ended up obviously going to Yale. He turned out for freshman crew, and I think has been quite willing to admit that he had a pretty swelled head when he got down there.
He stroked my freshman crew.
And stroked the Tommy Charlton's freshman crew. He thought he was a pretty big shot, having competed, one heat in the 52 Olympic trials, and sadly, he ended up for the better part of 3 years as an upperclassman, never getting a seat in the varsity boat. He was in the third boat, the second boat, until one day in the spring of 1956, where the protocol at the Yale boathouse was that no boats went on the water until the varsity crew was on the water. And there was a sophomore at the time in the number 2 seat of what was then the first boat who was late for practice. And the coach finally got frustrated waiting, and he turned around and he pointed to Dave White and he said, "Dave, get in the 2 seat." And changed Dave's life. Because that boat got on the water, and I could tell from the minute the boat got on the water that that was a big improvement in the boat. And Jim pulled up later with the sophomore in the boat that was late, and actually that sophomore never ever got back in the boat. Dave made a huge difference, and Tommy reflected on why he always ended up in the bow of the boat, and I'd like to reflect on that a little bit now that I've coached high school crew for 12 years since I retired. I have always said that the first and the easiest 2 seats I ever have to put in a boat are bow and 2, because the requirements are interesting. Number one, they tend to be the lightest guys because you don't want to load the front end of the boat. So they tend to be your lightest guys, and they also tend to be actually your best rowers in terms of technique, because the 2 bow seats are critical. They're critical to the set of the boat, the balance of the boat, and they're critical to the track of the boat, because the 2 guys in the bow can really manage the set, and if they pull equally, they can manage the straightness of the boat of which you can steer. So I've always ended up, almost always, the bowman was the first guy that's ever obvious to me had to be in the bow of the boat. And I think Jim Rashmit, Tommy was always Jim Rashmit's favorite. Tommy was always going to be in the bow of the varsity boat. I can just say that from experience. Dave White was a beautiful oarsman. Couldn't have been any different physically than Tommy. Tommy, 5'11", 167 pounds maybe. Dave White was 6'4", and if you ever see a picture of our crew, there's Tommy, and then there's Dave White, and then there's John Cook, who comes back down. But that's the story of Dave White and how Dave White ended up at Yale, right place, right time, in what became the Olympic crew. John Cook was in the number 3 seat of the boat. Turns out there were 4 sophomores in the 1956 Olympic crew. John Cook at 3, Rusty Wales at 7, Bob Morey as the stroke, and I was the coxswain. John Cook, by far, was the most unlikely of anybody in that boat to have ended up in an Olympic gold medal crew. John grew up in the Naugatuck Valley sort of a blue-collar industrial stretch of Connecticut in a little town called Ansonia, Connecticut, which is actually the next town up from Derby, Connecticut, where we have our boathouse on the Housatonic River. His father was a labor organizer. He's a very blue-collar sort of upbringing. And John ended up at Yale purely because of a math teacher that he had at Ansonia High School. John played football at Ansonia High School. He was quite a bright kid, very good at math, and his math teacher, his senior year in school, when John was thinking about what he wanted to do, suggested that he apply to Yale. Well, Yale was the last thing he had ever imagined would ever be a part of his life, but he applied, got accepted to Yale, and went out for football in the fall, freshman football. Freshman football didn't work out very well for John. And in the middle of the winter, our freshman coach, a fellow by the name of Art Gilchrist, we used to call him Gilly, did a recruiting effort at the Payne Whitney Gymnasium, where they put up a sign, said, anybody interested in rowing, come by and we'll talk a little about rowing. And the varsity coach tells the story about Gilly coming back from that little effort and saying, well, did anybody show up? And Gilly's reply, well, just this one short fat guy showed up. That was John Cook. John came out for crew in the spring, first time, and spent very little time actually in a real show. There were a number of people out for freshman crew that had previous rowing experience. John was a complete walk-on. He had seen crew because he was close to the river where he grew up. He came out and spent a good part of the spring rowing in what we call the tub, which was a two-man lap streak boat, basically a pair, probably 3 or 4 feet wide so you couldn't turn it over, with a coxswain going up and down the river. And when there wasn't someone he could row the pair with, he rowed the launch. I don't even recall if he ever got a seat in the freshman first boat in the whole time we were at Derby, Connecticut in the spring. And we had our freshman crew had a very unproductive spring season. I think our best race was a tie in the Blackwell Cup, but we didn't win a race as far as I can recall. And in the end of the spring, we always go up to our crew camp in Gales Ferry, Connecticut. And I think I think our freshman coach didn't have the heart to tell John Cook that he couldn't come up to Gales Ferry with the crew, so he invited John up to Gales Ferry. And our prospects for the Harvard race were not particularly good because Harvard freshman crew at that point was undefeated and had won the Eastern Sprints. So while we were at Gales Ferry, we started doing some mixing and matching to see, how to put a crew together. I think that's one of the most important things that a crew coach does, is get the right people in the right seat in the boat. And somehow John Cook ended up in the 5 seat of the freshman crew. And behold, of all things, we beat the Harvard crew by open water. They were undefeated. We hadn't won a race fundamentally. We pulled the 2 boats together to exchange shirts after the race, and the Harvard 5-man turned to John Cook and said, gosh, how did you guys ever do that? And John Cook's reply was famous. He said, I have no idea. It was my first race. So we get back to Yale, and John Cook by that time is coming out for crew again as a sophomore. And of course the varsity coach, even with John Cook's seat in the freshman boat, wasn't paying any attention to John Cook again. He spent most of his sophomore year in the tub or in the 3rd or 4th varsity boat. And when he couldn't get in a boat, he'd ride the launch with Jim Rashmit and Jerry. And our boatman, a fellow by the name of Jerry Romano, lived in the same town as John Cook, another blue-collar guy. And we might have had one race. We might have raced BU or somebody. The boat still wasn't moving, and Jim Rashman, our varsity coach, had concluded that there was a break in the boat at the 3-seat, that the bow part of the boat wasn't really working with the stern part of the boat. And the problem was the guy sitting in the 3-seat. So one practice, Jim decided to put every starboard oarsman on the varsity squad in the 3-seat to see how the boat went. And he worked through the entire squad and was ready to turn the boats around and come into the dock. And he had not given John Cook a try at the 3-seat. And Jerry Romano said, "Excuse me, Jim, but why don't you give John Cook a try? Try John Cook in the 3-seat." And Rashman's reply, "Well, he doesn't know. The guy didn't know how to row. He was 5'11". He might have weighed 100 and maybe at that point 180 pounds, maybe something like that. He doesn't know how to row. Jim, just give the guy a chance." So Jim relented, turned the boats around, headed back upstream, put John Cook in the 3-seat. That was it. You could tell immediately. You guys know how a boat comes together. There is a thing about a boat called swing. Yeah, the worst thing in the world is to row a boat that feels like a ton of lead. When you get a boat that is really going well, there's this thing we all recognize as swing, where it's almost you can't pull hard enough. Boat just keeps flying. John Cook got a seat in that boat and never gave that seat up. He was in the 3-seat in every way subsequent to that in the 3 years he was at Yale. And I finally figured out what John Cook's secret was. I don't think there was ever a stroke that John Cook took sitting in a Yale crew that he did not pull as hard as he could. In fact, we often do what's called a paddle, just kind of a light row, and I had to always tell John to stop pulling. "John, stop pulling, we're just doing a paddle." He would not stop pulling. The guy just pulled forever. That's how John Cook ended up at Yale and in the 3-seat of an Olympic crew.
And he was strong.
And he was strong as an ox. In fact, I think he had a 3-inch extension on his seat because he was so short. I had to put a little riser in the seat to get him up. Yeah. Well, the next 2 seats in the boat are the number 4 and the number 5 seat, right the center of what we call the engine room, where you put the big, strong guys. And we had 3 big, strong guys in the boat in 4, 5, and 6 seat. Don Bear was number 4, Charlie Grimes was number 5, and Essie Esselstyn, who we'll get to in a minute, were the 3 big movers in the middle of the boat. Don Beer and Charlie Grimes were both the class of 1957. Both had rowed together at Groton School, and both came to Yale as freshmen. Don Beer was probably the most soft-spoken and quietest guy in the boat. He came from New York City, a family in New York City. I think he was probably the guy that was probably the quietest guy in the boat. I don't think any of us really knew Don Beer particularly well. What we did know about Don was he was a beautiful rower. In fact, John Cook used to always say that he was sure lucky to end up sitting in the 3-seat between Dave White at 2 and Don Beer at 4, who happened to be 2 of the most perfect oarsmen technically that ever rowed. If you ever wanted to film, the perfect rowing stroke, you could take either Dave White or Don Beer, but you generally leave out John Cook. He was just there to pull. In any event, Don Beer became the captain of the 57 crew. As we were working on combinations in 56, I remember, in fact, I got a picture at home of Don Beer in the stroke seat before Bob Morey took that over. But Don was a strong oarsman and pulled a very strong oar in the number 4 seat. Charlie Grimes was probably the most flamboyant of all the guys in the boat, most disruptive, probably the strongest, most outspoken, most disruptive, use whatever. adjective you want.
Jordan Oliver
Yes.
said that Charlie Grimes was the strongest man that he'd ever coached.
Well,
In football.
I remember hearing that.
Yeah.
I remember hearing that. And did he ever carry you up the stairs in the Yale boathouse?
I don't think so.
I
He probably
always,
tried.
I always tell the story
He probably
that
tried.
he picked you up one time and carried you up the stairs.
I
With
don't-
the,
I'm
the
sure.
Jim
I'm
Cook
sure.
boathouse.
I'm sure he tried. Charlie and I had a few issues from time to time.
Charlie had
He
issues
was
with everybody.
He was twice as big and twice as strong as I was.
The person he had the most issues with was the coach, Jim Rashman.
Yes.
Because Charlie Grimes insisted on playing 3 sports. Charlie Grimes wanted to play football, he wanted to play basketball, and he wanted to row. He was about 6'7". I think he wrote down on the weight chart. I think he lied every time on the weight chart, like Tom.
Yeah.
Tom lied, he added weight. Charlie lied because he took off weight. But Charlie probably tipped the scales at 210 and probably wrote down 195 or something like that.
At least 210, maybe 215.
Yeah, maybe 215. He was a very strong guy.
Size 7.
Well, yeah, the strange thing about Charlie's physique was he had size, I think it was size, no, I think it was size 9. I think he had size 9 feet, small hands, little head. It was a very strange body, but he was really strong. And Jim Rashmet was the kind of coach that if you rowed for Jim wanted you to row 3 seasons. He wanted you to row in the fall, he wanted you to do winter training in the tanks, and he wanted you to then to row in the spring. So Charlie Grimes didn't want to row in the fall, wanted to play football, didn't want to row in the winter, he wanted to play basketball, came out in the spring, and Jim Rashmet did everything he could do to ignore him, including calling him Gaines for a long time. Gaines this and Gaines that, which really pissed Charlie off. But in any event, what happened was, he put Charlie in the 4th boat, and the 4th boat would win all of the sprints on the water. So hell, he put him in the 3rd boat, then the 3rd boat would win all the sprints. He put him in the 2nd boat, the 2nd boat would win all the sprints. And he finally resorted to having to put him, no choice, into the number 5 seat in the varsity boat. So Charlie was a disruptor. In fact, I remember one famous story. This goes up to the year 1956, when we were training for the Harvard race at Gales Ferry. And I guess out of the water one day, the varsity managed to lose a couple of races to the junior varsity, which aggravated Charlie to no end. And when we came into lunch, the way the training tables are set up at Gales Ferry is the varsity table, where there are 9 people, 8 rowers, a coxswain, always set for 10 people. And there are 10 place settings, and there are 10 meals that go to 9 people, split among the 8 varsity rowers, of course. And the prize things at the table are the milk. So we come into lunch one day, and one of the milks is missing on the varsity table, and someone discovers it's at the JV table. And Charlie gets a fit, an uproar about the JV, thinking they're so smart they beat us on the water they could steal our milk. And in fact, it was Charlie that snuck into the dining room and put the milk on the JV table to anger the varsity, to get them perked up a little bit for the afternoon practice.
Charlie was never happy that he was in the middle of some disruptive. Charlie was like a volcano, you know. He was a force in himself.
He was a force
Schooling.
in himself.
I will never forget the occasion on our, I think it was, yes, it was my junior year, and it was the varsity race up at Harvard, and up in Gales Ferry, where we practiced, up in the rooms where the team slept and had their headquarters. But Charlie said, "S, you know, I know your dad's a doctor, but I wonder if you wouldn't mind checking something. Maybe something has rubbed off." And I said, "Well, what's that?" And he said, "Well, I've had this pain in my bottom, and I'm curious of what's going on. I don't think I see it very clearly." So I said, "Would you mind looking?" And I said, "No, fine, go ahead." So Charlie bent over, grabbed his cheeks, and there was this enormous rosette of prolapsed hemorrhoids from his bottom that I've ever seen.
Oh, jeez.
And this was before the race, and I just thought to myself afterwards, this guy really has guts to sit on those hemorrhoids for 4 miles and stroke and row as hard as you can. You are really a committed individual. That's just one of my really light, unusual stories of Charlie.
I knew Charlie had problems with hemorrhoids, but I didn't know he'd ask you to check them out.
Oh yes.
Oh, yeah. Well, I can also remember when we were up there, he got Bob Morey, who was the stroke of that boat, very unhappy one day by alleging that he had to go down to shave
The oar.
Bob's oar down so that he didn't have to pull as hard as the rest of the boat. And Bob was so upset about it that one night he snuck down with a flashlight to measure his blade.
I remember that.
And of course, he hadn't shaved the blade down.
Charlie
He was
was
just
never-
trying to make Bob aggravated.
Charlie was never happier than when there was turmoil in the boat.
Yeah.
Well, one thing, see, rowing at number 6 exposed me to a certain area of the environment that none of the rest of you had, because of his dietary indiscretions. Charlie had a certain type of bacterial flora in his intestinal tract that generated a fair amount of gas.
Oh, gee.
And now, as soon as the boat was rolling, I was always the first guy downwind and that's, I'm sure, why I rowed harder every time I hit that cloud.
The Charlie story in
Back
Yeah.
then, did you guys use seat racing or ergometers to prove that someone
we
was?
didn't have
We
ergometers.
didn't have ergs.
No
Ergs
ergs.
came later.
Yeah.
No ergs. No seat racing.
And no seat racing.
Oh, there was seat racing, sure, but the boat was pretty well settled. We had seat racing for sure. I mean, at different points.
but not the way they've done it.
No, not the
Not
way
the
they
way
do
they.
it.
Not the way you experience seat racing. No. Yeah. I think.
Jim had an intuitive idea in his own mind of what a oarsman should look like, especially blade work. Jim was he paid a great deal of attention to blade work. We spent hours and hours and hours doing various kinds of drills and things in getting your blade work perfect. And of course I never had an opportunity to do it, but I think if you were to get behind one of Jim's crews, not necessarily just ours, but any of his crews, with a movie camera and take photographs of one side, the 4 blades on one side of an 8 and 4 blades on the, you'd find them in absolutely perfect rhythm and perfect technique and everything else.
Maybe after the intros of the other rowers, we can go into some of the technique that he coached. If you.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty much a wrap up. I think on those two guys.